Steve sat at the chrome-edged Melmac kitchen table and ate thick pancakes his mother made in a huge cast-iron skillet. After breakfast, he put on his straw cowboy hat and walked out to the corrals, proudly walking with his old daddy. Joe saddled up a gentle old mare named Sadie for Steve. She was the quarter horse Steve usually rode. They rode out to join Mike Stilson, the ranch owner, and his two children, who had driven in his big new pickup to the ranch from their nice house in the small town, several miles away. The five rode out onto the spreading plains. The morning sun, bright and orange, cast long shadows from the scattered cholla, prickly pear cactus, and clumps of knee-high plains grass. They gathered about 200 head of cattle and moved them into corrals at one corner of the pasture. About 4 miles from the ranch headquarters, they worked as a team to drive each calf and a few older heifers into a special mechanical press at the end of a chute funnel at the side of the corral. Once in the press, Joe would pull down hard on the long handle to flip the animal on its side, held firmly between steel bars and plates. Then he would use his sharp pocket knife to cut a slit in the male calf's scrotum, reach inside to pull out the testicles, and then cut them off cleanly. He dropped each set of calf balls into a bucket of water so the two families could eat Rocky Mountain oysters for dinner that night. Next came the branding. A propane burner was left on full blast, heating a steel collar on the ground that had a couple of long branding irons propped over it. The brand symbols formed out of twisted iron bars set in the middle of the blue flame, staying white hot. For each calf he would grab the handle of the branding iron, swing it around carefully, and press it down firmly into the butt flesh of the kicking calf. It burned a deep scar through the hide, catching the calf's fur on fire a little. Joe dusted out the flames on the calf with his leather gloves. Each calf screamed and bawled until their tongues hung out and their eyes bulged. It was grim work for Steve. Finally, Joe instructed Steve to hold the calf's head down while he used a short apple coring tool to gouge out the tiny horn bones on each side of its skull. Blood flowed freely down the calf's head. The machine was levered until the calf stood upright. The metal chute was released to open position, and an electric prod on the calf's butt stimulated him to run forward out of the chute. Each calf ran around shakily, screaming for several minutes afterward. Every spring, the same disturbing scene was gutted out. Thus began Steve's distaste for cattle ranching. Shelley was the boss's 10-year-old daughter. She was in Steve's class at school, as they were both 10 years old. Shelley made a mistake. She was messing around and accidentally shot her .22 rifle once into the air. The popping sound distracted her father from whipping a heifer into the cattle chute. Mike dropped the fiberglass quirt to his side and stared hard at her. The cow took that opportunity to twist half in two, then kicked to reverse her body in the gate and funnel, and ran quickly back out into the corral. He whirled around at the sound, but saw it was too late. "God damn it, Shelley!" he yelled at his daughter as he turned and charged her with the quirt raised. "You stupid little cunt!" he screamed like an enraged animal. Shelley shuddered and dropped the rifle on the ground. Her face contorted in terror as tears ran down her face, holding her hands out in front of her. I'm sorry. Please don't beat me, Daddy. Please don't beat me," she screeched. As she crumpled to the ground, holding her arms over her face, her father leaned down over her and swung the quirt down again and again. He called her horrible names and kept yelling how worthless she was. He viciously beat her with many hard strokes that instantly raised long welts and some cuts on her arms, back, and exposed legs. She screamed and crawled like a cornered animal, begging him to stop. Her cries only seemed to enrage him further. He hit her with the small whip quicker and harder. Steve stood watching, frozen in horror, tears rolling down his hot cheeks as he feared for Shelley's life. He could not move. He could not think, and could not act. Why is he hurting his own daughter? Why won't he stop? Steve screamed inside his own head. Out of the corner of his eye, Steve saw his old daddy striding forward. This man he had become accustomed to seeing acquiesce to other people, to his mother, to his boss, and to his friends, everyone Steve had ever seen him in contact with. This man strode quickly and powerfully up to his boss and grabbed the quirt out of his hand. He raised one leg and kicked Mike in the side so hard he was launched through the air, tossing him several feet away into the dirt and cow shit. Joe stood leaning over his boss in just the same way he had menaced his own daughter. He glared down at his boss with clenched fists held out at an angle. "Damn it, Mike! What the hell is wrong with you, you goddamn shithead? Nobody beats a little girl like that. You could have killed your own daughter," he growled in a low, menacing voice. He moved to stand between Mike and Shelley. His boss jumped up and glared at Joe and passed him at Shelley. "It's none of your goddamn business," Mike yelled, shaking with rage. Joe did not move. In a commanding voice, he told his boss, "I advise you to run. If you take one step toward her, I'm going to kick the living shit out of you. Get out of here. Run. Now." Mike looked Joe in the eyes, and Steve saw the sudden fear that leapt to Mike's face. His old daddy's boss turned and ran away across the cow pasture without another word. The boss's son was nowhere nearby. He had been sent to round up some strays, so thankfully had missed the whole mess. Words cannot convey how much respect grew in Steve's heart for his old daddy that day. Steve thought to himself, "My dad is a real man. He cares about kids. He even cares enough to stand up to his boss for a little girl that's not even his own kid. My old daddy is a brave, strong man." Steve walked over to Shelley, still crumpled on the ground. She was curled into a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. Snot ran down her face. Bright red lines marked her all over. Some of them dripped with blood. Haltingly, he called out to her through his own tears. "Shelley? Shelley? Shelley, he's gone now. My daddy chased him away. You're all right now. Are you going to be okay? Does it hurt bad?" Joe saw how traumatized Steve was. He leaned down to put his face next to his son's, and with pain in his eyes said firmly, "Boy, I need you to go sit down over there by the fence in the shade. Do you think you can do that? I will take care of Shelley. She's going to get over this. You'll see. Go on now and sit in the shade. It's all over now. Everything's going to be all right." Steve hugged his daddy's leg hard, crying, "Oh, help her, Daddy, help her!" He leaned down and hugged Steve for just a second, then said, "I will. Now go sit down and calm down. She's going to be okay, I promise." Steve backed away slowly and stumbled a few times until he finally crumpled on the ground in the shade and began to bawl to himself. He watched closely as his old daddy gently picked Shelley up like a wreathing blob. He whispered calm words in her ear, just like he did to his horses sometimes. He told her it was over, that he wouldn't let anyone hurt her again, and it was okay to cry, and that everything was going to work out in the end. He promised her he wouldn't let her dad hit her again. He carried her over to a bale of hay and lay her down on it. While she cried and clung to him, he surveyed her welts and cuts. He shook his head sharply a few times and gasped as he discovered just how injured she really was. "Boy, I need you to run to the pickup and get that old blanket out from behind the seat. Bring it to me. Can you do that?" he calmly asked Steve. There was so much tension in his voice, Steve could tell he was really worried for her. But Steve could not reply. He ran as fast as he could, wrenched the blanket from behind the seat, and ran it back to Joe, half of it trailing behind him on the ground. "Here it is, Daddy," he cried, feeling happy to help even in this small way. Joe gently lifted her in one arm as he used the other to toss the blanket over the bale. He lowered her slowly onto the blanket as she winced in pain. She was shaking uncontrollably now, in shock. Steve watched, worried, as his old daddy wrapped her up in the blanket, being careful with her injuries. Then he picked her up inside the blanket and started walking to Mike's new pickup truck. Steve got the passenger door open, so Joe had no problem setting her inside. "Get in, Steve, and sit beside her. Try to keep her talking," he instructed Steve. Steve got in beside her, and Joe ran around to the driver's side, got in and started the engine. He drove fast in Mike's pickup down the bumpy dirt road in the pasture until they hit the gravel county road. He crossed the cattle guard quickly and sprayed gravel with the pickup's tires as he turned and headed to the little town where his boss and his wife lived. He kept talking to Shelley and Steve the whole time, assuring them in as calm a voice as he could that everything was going to be all right. When they got to the boss's house, he turned off the engine and coasted to a stop, got out and came around to the passenger side. Steve already had the door open and had jumped out, so Joe reached in and carefully lifted Shelley out. "Stay here, kid. I'll deal with this," was all Joe said as he carried her to the front door. He used his boot to knock quickly on the door. Shelley's mother came to the door as soon as she saw the state Shelley was in from inside the blanket in Joe's arms. She hollered and cried. Joe carried her quickly inside and gave the woman instructions. "She needs a doctor. You need to call the doctor. These cuts need to be cleaned and bandaged right away, before the doctor even gets here. Everything is going to be all right. I will stay with you as long as you need me. Does your telephone work?" Steve heard him telling Shelley's mom through the open front door. Then Joe shut the front door, and Steve stood waiting by the gate, worried, upset, and scared. A half hour passed. Then the small town's only doctor, an aged retired man, drove up quickly and jumped out of his car, his big black bag in hand. He rushed past Steve and knocked on the front door. The door opened and he was quickly ushered in. Another half hour passed. The county sheriff had been on a rare visit, drinking coffee and talking with the owner of the single small gas station in the town. He was alerted to the situation by the doctor, and thus arrived quickly. Shortly after that, Joe came slowly walking out to the sidewalk. He reached out and took his son's hand, leading him back to the pickup. "It's all over now, but for her body to mend, kid. Let's go home now. We've both had enough for one day. The sheriff says he'll take over now. Maybe your mama has something good for lunch. Let's go see, shall we? Then I think we're done cowboying for this day. We'll have to go back and turn the cows out to pasture," he consoled Steve. When Steve listened to his parents' early morning coffee conversation the next morning, he was not surprised to hear Rosie say, "Maybe it is about time we left here and start making a life for ourselves on our own land. We should try homesteading in Canada again." Joe replied, "Oh no, not this again." Steve did not see Shelley for a long time after that. Mike was arrested and charged with something, but eventually he paid off people until most of the consequences went away. His wife did not let him come home for several months and nearly divorced him, although she was a strong Catholic. He actually did clumsily thank Joe much later for intervening. Around Joe, Steve saw only fear of his father in Mike's eyes ever after that. Months later, whenever Shelley came to the ranch, driven and escorted by her mother, she would only ride her Palomino horse with Steve's old daddy. She looked up to him as a hero. She told him secrets. She had a complete crush on him that he always firmly but lovingly rebuffed. Steve once heard him tell her, "If you were my little girl, I would never hurt you." She smiled brightly and said, "Oh, I wish I could be yours. How come I can't? Why can't I be your daughter?" He just smiled grimly and replied, "I wish it were that easy. But you've got folks that love you. Your daddy does love you in his own way. He'll do right by you in the end, I'm sure. It's going to be okay." Joe stayed on through the winter, but in the spring, he announced that his family was moving back to Canada to try homesteading again. Rosie heartily supported him. 4 years later, the Gannys were told through the grapevine that Mike had died suddenly in a tragic accident. Steve said to himself, "Good. I'm glad he's dead. Take care of yourself, Shelley."